listening to Pharmacy, IT, and Me, your informatics pharmacist podcast. Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of the Pharmacy, IT, and Me podcast. I'm your host, Tony Dow, and today we actually have a very special guest, a manager over at First Data Bank, Dr. Christine Sommer. Thank you for being on the podcast today. How are you doing?
I'm doing great, Tony. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, of course. We focus a lot on this podcast about pharmacy informatics, and I know you're in the pharmacy informatics space / the drug information space, and it's really exciting for me to actually talk to you about this because I don't think I've ever spoken with anyone from the side of like on your side, like First Data Bank side, like the vendor of like all the drug information. So it's really exciting for me to talk to you today. And just before we get started and talking about all that stuff, can you tell the listeners a little bit about yourself and your current like day-to-day role?
Certainly. I am a clinical informaticist, pharmacist at First Data Bank, and I am the manager of the team that maintains First Data Bank's drug allergy, drug-drug interaction, and our pharmacogenomics content. So First Data Bank is one of a few providers of computerized drug information that's used within the healthcare space. We're used in both the ambulatory setting, so outpatient pharmacies, retail settings in terms of both product data, pricing information, and clinical data, as well as the inpatient side, so the pharmacy dispensing systems within a hospital, the ordering systems within a lot of the large EHR vendors, and those sort of spaces. We're also provide data to a lot of third-party providers and state Medicaid programs, various insurance companies, and those sort of spaces. And also other areas such as long-term care as well. And so what First Data Bank does is we take all of the drug information, everything from the NDC, the National Drug Code, the trade name, the generic ingredients, the drug formulation, all of those various product type information, classify it, and then we also provide clinical data, such as the alerts that my team focuses on, which, drug allergy, drug-drug interactions, genomic alerts, everything from patient education, indications, contraindications, and all of those sort of things, and translate that into data that can be used by the computer system.
Awesome. So, you've been doing this for quite some time now, and the kind of like the pharmacy informatics space has kind of evolved a lot over the last 50 years or so. And I see that you've started like in around like 1994. It's right here it says. And I wanted to ask about like how'd you kind of like get into that field of like doing the drug information stuff?
Well, I had always been interested in drug information as a pharmacy student. While I was in pharmacy school, I worked in the long-term care environment, but was always interested, in drug information. And I did kind of wonder, how did all of those alerts get into the computer system we were using? And I had the opportunity to do a rotation in my PharmD degree experience at First Data Bank, and that's how I really found out about the company. And it turned into essentially a 5-week job interview because after I graduated, I was hired on full-time, and I've been with the company ever since.
Oh, that's really cool. So I guess like since you did your rotation there and you got the job there over like the last 30 years of you being there, how have you seen kind of like your particular role change and evolve over that time?
I think it's changed a great deal. When I first started at First Data Bank, we were using a mainframe, and we essentially had, what used to be referred to as a dumb terminal because you just interacted with the mainframe on it. You couldn't do any word processing or even send an email on it. It was essentially just a monitor. And we've evolved now into obviously desktop computers and large databases. We've migrated off the mainframe system, ages ago. And with that change in technology, we're also seeing a lot more changes in the types of information that is available on medications. So, when I first started, the cytochrome P450 system was, still relatively new. We knew that, certain drugs impacted other drugs. Now we're able to predict those interactions a lot more specifically, prior to a drug's marketing. So now we know more than ever about new drugs than we do about some older drugs that have been on the market a lot longer because of those advances in technology. And, companies like First Data Bank have had to keep up with those changes in drug knowledge to be able to properly classify and inform clinicians about potential risks of medications.
That's interesting. So, yeah, it's kind of like there's just so much information about drugs out there, and I guess I'm curious, right? Like when back in like the early '90s, of like when First Data Bank was still like developing a lot of the drug databases, what kind of information was kind of like already like standard back then, and then what kind of new information, like new databases, kind of got added over time? Like, I guess my question is more about like, okay, we know drug-drug interactions, that's like the core thing of like, looking at clinical data for drugs. But other things like pharmacogenomics, or like newer things with like drug allergy components, like were they databases that were already existing, or did it kind of like get added on as time evolved?
Well, I think a little of both. So, certainly, probably our first clinical modules were drug-drug interactions and drug allergy alerting. And, the basic concepts haven't changed. If you're allergic to drug A, you might also be allergic to drug B. If you're taking drug C, you shouldn't take drug D because of an interference in the metabolism. So those are still basic components. What we're seeing with those older modules is an ability to more refine the alerts through increased knowledge of drug metabolism, through increased knowledge of drug structures. So we're no longer limited to saying this class interacts with that class. We're able to say with more specificity that if you have reaction to, say, a sulfonamide antibiotic, you're not allergic to all drugs that have a sulfonamide moiety. So we're able to get more specific with the data in those older modules. And then we also have newer modules, as you mentioned, one of which is one that my team works on, which is our pharmacogenomics module. And that provides alerts between a patient's genome and a given drug. So, based upon their genetic makeup, they may not be able to metabolize a certain drug, or they may metabolize some drugs faster than others. And so that makes tailoring patients' medical therapy a lot more specific.
I see, I see. So it does sound like, of course, FDB has to like be ever evolving to provide the right information to the clinician. And I guess like one of the other things I'm curious about too is like what kind of challenges have you faced in terms of like how FDB needs to integrate with different EHR systems? Like is there like a standard way that the systems have to interact, or do you kind of like have to cater towards different ways that systems interact with the database?
Typically, it's a little of both. So we have our files set up in a certain format, and the vendors who utilize First Data Bank data will program to those files. We also have, APIs that allow them to program to kind of a layer of programming over those files. And utilizing that technique, we're able to make, additional changes underneath, kind of underneath the hood, so to speak, that don't impact vendor systems. And that's getting a little technical in the programming weeds there. But there's different techniques that we can use, to kind of minimize disruptions that way when they're programming to our code versus programming to our data files. If they're programming directly to our data files, then when we make a change to that file, or, add additional data, then they would have to update their coding behind the scenes. So there's different techniques that can be involved. It can take a while for vendors to implement new file strategies, new products, new attributes that we're adding to our data. We try to work with the major vendors when we're developing new products and new functionality so that they're kind of ready for it at the same time we are. That's the ideal strategy.
I see, I see. So, thanks for sharing that. And, I'm thinking about too, like the role of drug information and, pharmacy informatics. And, when I was going through school and we were being shown, what a drug information pharmacist does, it was taught to us. A lot of it is basically knowing where to find your information and knowing, just how to do the research, all your resources and things like that. But from your end, working at First Data Bank, it seems like the role of a drug information pharmacist is more tied to the clinical informatics side. And I guess like how have you seen that role change from, being at first just doing the research stuff to now kind of like having to know how to use the technical systems and marrying all that stuff together to get like the database in a great way for the users. Does that kind of make sense what I'm asking?
I think so. So, kind of the space that a clinical informaticist at First Data Bank is kind of, in a way, we're a small subset of the drug information pharmacy world and kind of a small subset of the informatics world at the same time. And we're kind of marrying those two positions in that we still have to know, as you mentioned, where to find all the answers. That's the real key. When we're researching, should we add a drug interaction between these two agents? We're looking at labeling, we're looking at approval packets, we're looking at medical literature, clinical trials as well as case reports and so forth. And we're gathering all that information. And then once we make a clinical decision, then we've got to kind of shift and put on our informatics hat and say, okay, how do we translate this knowledge into usable data for the clinician? And then we also have to think about our various audiences because, we have not just the pharmacist, but we also now have prescribers interacting with the data as well through CPOE systems and so forth. And so we have to kind of translate that drug information into usable informatics content. So it's kind of a marriage between the two worlds.
That's really interesting to me because the way that I've always described pharmacy informatics is already a marriage of like clinical side with like the technology side. And then now your role is also marrying the drug information side into that as well. So I think like it's really, really cool that that's another kind of avenue of like where a pharmacist can play a role. And I was curious about like, your team size. Like, I don't know if you could share this, but how big is the team that works on, updating all this information?
Well, my team consists of 5 pharmacists and a pharmacy technician. And we oversee, as I mentioned, just the allergy, interaction, and pharmacogenomic data. So we have other teams at First Data Bank that maintain other data like product data, patient education materials, drug disease content, such as contraindications, indications, geriatric precautions, pregnancy and lactation, those sort of warnings modules, side effect content. The list goes on. So there's various teams working on all of this information, and we specialize in our own areas.
I think to me it's very impressive, and it's the thing I want to say is that from me working at a hospital and using EHRs and that connect to these databases, it's I guess like it's hard to appreciate the fact of like there's a large team behind this entire database and knowing just your own just the module your team works on. already has like, 5 pharmacists and a pharmacy technician. That's impressive to know that module alone has that many clinical people working on it, and kind of like, at least for me, puts a better perspective of like appreciating how much work is put into like having all this stuff updated for end users and for clinicians and things like that. I do want to ask though, the allergy side,
Mhm.
when you guys are developing those interactions, do you go by a standard of like SNOMED codes, or what, some type of standard when you codify the allergies?
When we're codifying allergies, we have First Data Bank proprietary codes that we have an allergen group code and a cross sensitivity group code that we link drug ingredients to. So from First Data Bank's proprietary concepts are then linked to either RX norm or SNOMED codes. So in the United States, RX norm is the standard interoperability code for drug products and ingredients. And then SNOMED codes are utilized for allergen groups. And so that would be used in an interoperability setting to map between First Data Bank and the other knowledge base vendors.
I see, I see. Okay, that's interesting. I didn't know that. It's pretty interesting for me to like learn about this on the side of like your end, because I'm so like closed off on the hospital side, and it's really interesting. I hope the listeners are also interested in this too. And like kind of like adding on to like the whole part of managing the database and updating all of this stuff. One of the big things, which I'm sure you probably heard a ton of, is this whole idea of AI taking over. And what are your thoughts in terms of not so much AI taking over, but is AI going to be beneficial? If so, how will it be beneficial for, I guess, the work that your team is doing or the work that the organization is doing? Where do you kind of see that going?
So First Data Bank has certainly been exploring the use of AI. What we're focusing on right now are ways that AI can assist us in doing our daily tasks so that we can free up clinicians to do more clinical stuff versus the mechanics of getting the data into place. So how can we let pharmacists be pharmacists, and where can we use AI to assist with that? In terms of generative AI use, what we're finding is just that it's too inconsistent in responses in terms of content. Sometimes it's too verbose, sometimes it's not verbose enough. It's very inconsistent in terms of how it replies. So I think clinicians are used to seeing the same information. When a drug interaction alert pops up, the alert looks the same every time. When you start using generative AI for that, it looks a little different every time because the wording is different, because it's creating all that language on the fly, so to speak. So I don't think it's quite ready for that clinical use yet. Where we've seen success in AI use in medicine, certainly we've seen good results in like the radiology and those type of settings. And we're certainly seeing advances with regards to ambient listening, freeing up clinicians' times to be able to generate a note, and they can actually focus on the patient during the patient visit with the use of that ambient listening and the AI assistant in the background. So that's certainly where we're seeing the most success right now. In terms of the future, I think we'll continue to see more and more advances in AI. And I think that pharmacists in general just need to really stay alert and stay up to date with the technologies and see where it's going and continue to monitor the advances and the uses in AI. And I also recommend that they really take a look at how AI is being used in their niche of healthcare.
Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, I totally agree. I think like I've said this multiple times before, but it's more of like having us being at the table when these decisions of AI are being made, just to kind of make sure it is being made with the good intentions instead of like replacing, functions that pharmacists do. I think one of the things too that, the listeners of this podcast are typically people who are very interested in the pharmacy informatics field. And I wanted to ask you, like, in terms of your specific role, like, what kind of skills did you think that was essential in being able to be successful in your role?
I would say some of the most valuable skills in my particular area have been one, a great good skills in evaluating medical literature, the ability to consolidate information from a variety of sources into one cohesive answer. So, sort of those basic drug information skills. Another thing that's been very helpful is just the ability to multitask and prioritize. We may have a project we're working on and a new drug will come out. So you have to pivot and shift your attention to that new drug and what information needs to go on as a top priority because we've got a build going out tomorrow. So what's the most important thing about that drug to get on? How much can we get on the new database so that clinicians have that information available to them? And then be able to shift back to that other project you were working on, in a day or two after that new drug goes out in the build. So, multitasking, pivoting, and drug information, I think, are the main skills. But certainly the ability to adapt to new technologies. As I mentioned, we started out on dumb terminals, and now we're using powerful desktop computers to link into our database system and maintain our data. And we're able to interact with teams across various divisions and locations more effectively. And you just need to be able to pivot and use new technology as well.
I like that you emphasize these are skills that are not like specific to just like pharmacy, but they're like adaptable skills. And I think that's very important. So I think like I want to also ask if you have any particular advice you want to provide people who are interested into getting into a field, similar to where you are at First Data Bank.
I would say my advice would be to continue to keep up your clinical skills as well as your drug information skills. So I still practice in a community hospital a couple times a month to keep up my patient skills and to really see what's going on in the real world of pharmacy in terms of how the data is being used in the marketplace, how clinicians are still interacting with patients, how drugs are being ordered and used. So I think it's important to keep up your clinical skills and not just focus on technology. While the technology is obviously an important part of what we do, we can't forget the clinical side as well.
I think that's a really, really good piece of advice. I too am also still tied to a different hospital where I provide, my clinical brain. And I think it's very important that we are still, considered pharmacists first and then technology second. So thanks for, sharing that advice. And if people had, any other questions for you, what's the best way they can reach out to you?
Yes, I'm happy to interact with people who are interested in hearing more about medical informatics, and people can reach out to me on LinkedIn.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for taking your time to be on the podcast today. I learned a lot. I hope our listeners learned a lot. I know that you're very busy, so thank you so much. And I'll let you get back to your day, but thank you.
Well, thank you, Tony.
All right. If you like our show, please share with your friends, or you can help us out by writing a review on Apple Podcasts or any of your other favorite podcasting services. You can also check us out on social media on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, or LinkedIn, and you can also reach out to me at tony@pharmacyitme.com. If you want to network, you can check out the Pharmacist Slack group at pharmacistconnect.com, which is PHARMACISTSCONNECT.com. There's different topic channels, including informatics, and I've met some great colleagues on there, and I look forward to connecting with you as well. Thank you again for listening, and I'll see you on the next episode of Pharmacy IT and Me. And remember, technology is a tool, patient care is the goal.